All right. Thank you, Janelle, and thank you, Dave, for the intro. Jennifer mentioned a little bit about our work with ARP, Livable Communities in the Technical Advisors Program. This is really fun, interesting work that we get to do working with you all and different communities across the country, thinking about housing policy and housing needs for older adults. The thing that I would mention before we get into this conversation, I know there's probably a lot of folks on this call that do work with older adults, either in a housing context or some other policy or program context. But in the housing space, it really is true that any housing policies and plans and investments that work for older adults work really well for everybody in our communities. And so I really like to preface this, we focus our information and our presentation on older adults, but all of these things are really helpful in creating communities that are livable, desirable places to live for everybody throughout our communities. So just that, wanted to preface that before we get into the presentation. Next slide, please, Jennifer. So we're going to cover a few things today. The first part, as Dave mentioned, there was a housing needs assessment for the state that was conducted by the North Dakota State Housing Finance Agency and North Dakota State University. We're going to go over some of those key findings from that report that's specific about older adults and housing needs for older adults and some trends in there to sort of set the stage for our conversations around policies. I'm going to talk a little bit about middle housing. I'll define more of what that is, but it relates really well to the poll question that everybody just answered. We're then going to talk about accessory dwelling units or ADUs, and then have a wrap up and then go into questions and conversation for the remainder of our time today. Next slide, please, Jennifer. So some of our key findings from the housing needs assessment. Overall, North Dakota has seen pretty rapid population growth over the last decade, with an increase in about 16% total population, with almost 780,000 residents across the state in 2020. A lot of that was due to in-migration of sort of the working age population as job growth and sort of recruitment for employers ramped up in the 2010s through 2020 or so. I think we could talk about some of the shifts that are happening now with some of those employers and what's driving demand in a little bit different ways, but there's a lot of migration due to employment growth for working age adults during that time period. Among this growth, the baby boomer generation in that same period of time grew by from 2010 to 2020, grew by about 26%. So there's a large increase in the sort of baby boomer generation, some older adult workers, some just folks that are aging throughout the state that increase the population share of that baby boom generation. The population 65 plus is projected to increase by 25% by 2025. So that's a pretty rapid escalation and increase in the amount of older adults. And it's important to think about the housing needs and sort of needs within a community as folks age in place and want to stay in their neighborhoods, their communities. Next slide, please, Jennifer. Some notes a little bit on the sort of needs within the physical structures of people's residences. These can be single family homes or other apartments, other kinds of housing types. But 1 in 3 older individuals age 65 plus reported some form of disabling condition in 2020. So about 32% of older adults 65 plus have some form of disabling condition. As more people in that 65 plus age group continue to grow and age in place, it's likely that share of folks with the disability will also proportionally increase. And this is also higher for certain segments of the population. So specifically, the American Indian population has a 48% disability rate for folks that are 65 and older. So it's important to also note that there's sort of specific community and cultural needs within our communities around different abilities and housing to meet a different range of abilities. The figure here, figure 10 on the bottom, just shows the types of disabilities from that research conducted by the Center for Social Research around how those disabilities line up, whether it's an ambulatory disability or hearing disability or something related to independent living for older adults. But it's important for us to think about what this means in terms of housing needs and policies and investments to be able to support this increasing need over time. Next slide, please, Jennifer. So there are some different opportunities to think about how to address and keep older folks sort of aging in place. We consistently hear throughout the communities in which we work, that a lot of older adults just want to stay either in their homes and be able to have their homes adaptable to their changing life conditions and physical needs over time, or stay within their communities, being able to age in the neighborhoods. So keeping homeowners in their homes, AARP has a lot of really great resources on how to support home upgrades to be able to allow folks to age in place over time in more comfortable ways. The Home Fit Guide, which is shown here, is one good resource to be able to look to. And it's also important to think about thinking about aging in place as a way of thriving in place over time, over people's life cycles, individuals' life cycles, and the ability to stay in the same home is easier and has more space oftentimes for a caregiver, if that's or a family member as a caregiver, if those things need to happen over time as well. Planning for age-friendly neighborhoods or age-friendly communities is something that I think we're going to focus in a little bit more today, focus on housing, especially for older adults. Should be located near public transit and other important services. And there should be housing types, more diverse housing types and housing options for older adults and all residents throughout their life cycle that meet their diverse needs over time. So we're going to talk a little bit about some sort of policies that have been enacted in other places and some approaches to regulations to think about encouraging that and allowing that in more ways. There are some financial incentives and sort of property tax incentives to think about specific to older adults to allow both the age in place improvements with home improvements, as well as sort of neighborhood scale aging at that neighborhood community level. There's opportunities to think about both new construction and what we call conversion for housing needs for older adults. So we're going to talk today about a lot of the opportunities to create new housing to meet that housing need that Dave talked about, that housing shortage, and how that relates to older adults. But also important to think about the opportunities for conversion. If folks want to stay in their home, there's opportunities to use homes in different ways than just a large detached single family structure, converting into multiple units, having more space, more of a sort of studio apartment type space for a caregiver, for example. And so thinking about both the new construction and the sort of internal conversion of existing houses to be able to support folks' housing over time. Next slide, please, Jennifer. Some more findings on the price side of housing in North Dakota. So gross rent, total rents in North Dakota have grown by 49% over the past decade. So from 2010 to 2020, multifamily rents have increased by about 50%, which is a large increase in rents. 36% of renters in the state were cost burdened during this period of time, compared to 14% of homeowners. Overall, 1 in 4 North Dakota households ages 65 and up were cost burdened in 2020. And that is for older adults who rent, it's even higher. About half of older adults who rent were cost burdened over the last 10 years as well, or in 2020. So a large share of cost burdening across the state, but also older households, especially older renters, are more likely to be cost burdened. Next slide, please, Jennifer. So some opportunities to tee up our conversation today on some of the policies to provide various housing options for older adults. We just need more housing and more different types of housing to support adults aging in their neighborhood, aging in place, aging in their communities. One of the things that we always spend a lot of time is how to focus on building sometimes smaller, and those tend to be lower price in general because they're smaller, age-friendly housing options that aren't as big as what we see in housing development trends for detached single-family new construction of large detached single-family homes. And then the need for more rental options as well. So how do we create housing options for a range of folks that's not just home ownership, but rental opportunities as well? Home ownership is important throughout the life cycle of folks to create that stability, but need more rental options as well. Next slide, please, Jennifer. So some key state and local actions to support housing needs of older adults. We sort of think about these different categories of opportunities for really both community organizations like AARP, local government, state government agencies, to sort of work together to advance different opportunities for different income levels. So we have different household income levels that require different amount of programs and subsidies and investments to be able to support housing at those different income levels. In general, coordination, coalition building, and partnerships is one of the biggest early things that groups can do to help support more housing options, specifically for older adults. This webinar is a really good example of that coordination, coalition building, starting to have those conversations. analyzing housing needs and progress and providing education. The work from the Housing Finance Agency and the HNA with North Dakota State University is a way to do that, to start to have a really solid baseline, common understanding of what needs are, what our housing stock looks like today, and where needs are into the future. That can set up the prioritization around opportunities for regulatory or permitting process improvements, or just shifting our housing policy framework thinking a little bit to better meet the needs, unmet needs of households across North Dakota. And then also thinking about the financial incentives and tools and grants that might be available to be able to support lower income households, older adult households, for example, or be able to support more of that sort of aging in place through home improvement or weatherization programs and things like that. Next slide, please, Jennifer. We like to use this chart here that's in front of you to show that in an individual's housing needs over their lifetime really change depending on where you are at your stage of life, and that this chart sort of reflects this continuum or this journey of housing needs over time. And what we really focus on is helping communities think about how to meet these different really important life cycle points for households through the housing that's available in their communities. So one of the things we'll talk about today is a better way to do that for using middle housing policies and accessory dwelling units to get there. Older adults specifically, as you get sort of later in your life cycle of housing, really need housing with lower maintenance needs, housing needs, and start to have more needs around sort of accessibility and universal design. Accessibility, universal design components are things like having wide enough doorways and hallways to get through with mobility devices, having the ability to have finishings within a housing unit that are adaptable over time to people's needs as their needs change over time or their mobility might change over time. Next slide, please, Jennifer. So I'll talk a little bit about middle housing. And as a preface, before we get into the sort of meat of the slides here, middle housing, we sort of define as really everything between that single family residential and apartment housing type that most folks had identified as the places that they had lived in. So 96% of you said you've lived in apartments, 89% said that you've lived in single family housing. What we're talking about is really everything in between. How to support more of that housing that really isn't super prolific or built that often in our communities, and how do we support more of that from a policy or investment standpoint. Next slide, please, Jennifer. So there's some examples here. Middle housing, generally we talk about it. Opticos Design, who's also a technical assistance provider through AARP and a frequent collaborator of ours, has defined middle housing as house scale buildings with multiple units in neighborhoods. And generally what we talk about is sort of duplex, triplex, fourplex, cottage cluster type housing that is really built at a scale that's very similar to what we sort of see and feel as a single family character. So it's more units, generally smaller units, but really within a scale that's similar to a single family development type. Re-legalizing or allowing a diversity of housing options such as townhomes, duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes, and cottage clusters is increasingly becoming one of the community's most highest ranked tools into providing housing options for a variety of folks, and is an emerging topic of implementation and new policies for communities throughout the country. Next slide, please, Jennifer. And one of the reasons that we need to think about that, again, is because there's very diverse housing needs that for a diverse population in all of our communities in which we work. And that middle housing, generally, these housing types that we're talking about, most of the time fall into what we would call sort of middle income or workforce housing income sort of price ranges. So anywhere between about 70% area median income AMI to about 120% AMI. And the interesting thing with this price point is most affordable housing resources are generally targeted to lower income households, about 60% AMI and below. Market rate housing generally is created about 100%, 120% AMI and above. This is a way to get housing in that sort of middle income price point that doesn't require as much or any public subsidy to be able to get to those price points, through policy objectives and through regulations that allow this kind of housing. By its nature of being smaller, there's some land efficiency. You're getting more units for the land that you have. You're able to sort of decrease the pricing of those units. The other thing that's interesting too is that middle housing does create more of that flexibility between both rental housing needs and ownership housing needs. And on the ownership side is a good new construction option that is a lot of times, and in most cases, less expensive than detached single family housing too. So a way to get folks into the ownership market, provide that stability at a lower price point than new construction detached single family housing. Next slide, please, Jennifer. So here's just some more examples of what this housing types looks like. The photos on the left-hand side of your screen here are different photos from communities that we've given these presentations to across the country, and generally range in between this cottage housing type thing, which is, smaller units, sort of clustered around a common shared courtyard, sort of shared open space around those, to more sort of on the top right photo on the left-hand side of your screen, you can see more of a sort of duplex townhouse type configuration. Sometimes on the bottom left-hand photo that you see here, it's really hard to tell that this is even a duplex unless you looked at the doors or the amount of mailboxes that are on this structure. So a lot of times they are so in scale with some of the single family character that you really can't even tell that there's multiple units in here unless you start to count the mailboxes. But there's different ways to achieve these. Different ways to sort of prioritize open space and accessibility, parking access and scale that really meet the needs of communities within the context of the sort of neighborhood scale in which people live. Next slide, please, Jennifer. So why encourage middle housing? I'll go through some points here. Generally, middle housing, we try to sort of focus and target regulations to prioritize and produce smaller unit sizes that create more housing choices, again, that aren't really available in a lot of our communities today, or at least not at a scale where the housing need is. They provide a lot of potential for multi-generational housing as well, which is really, really important for older adults and aging population. You can do multi-generational in a couple different ways. Jennifer's going to talk about ADUs, but also just allowing a space for maybe an older adult to move into a smaller apartment type unit within an existing house, and they have family members or friends, or can rent out the larger part of the house as its own separate unit. It allows that sort of multi-generational living to occur within the same building or the same parcel. Middle housing is generally lower cost than new detached housing as well. There's some additional sort of costs that are different when you start to have shared walls and shared utilities and some of those things. But as a whole, sort of the total cost of those units generally tend to be less than detached single family housing. As we talked about already, can create more homeownership opportunities than exist today. Integrates with single family neighborhoods and existing neighborhoods very well. Potential for greater socioeconomic integration through more variety of housing types, sizes, and prices within neighborhoods. And just generally expands the housing supply in areas with little available land. And this is one of the biggest constraints, given the housing shortage. There's the sort of land availability, market constraints, and then also sometimes labor constraints with contractors. But the land component here is a way to use land a little bit more efficiently to get more housing as well. Next slide, please, Jennifer. So I'm going to get into the weeds very quickly, but I think it's worth mentioning some of these sort of best practices, especially for folks that might start having conversations around zoning codes or regulations and implementation. These are some of the best practices. We've got a forthcoming report with AARP that is going to be, it's a model state act for middle housing policies that AARP will be releasing in the next month or two. These best practices are reflected in there, so I wanted to cover these as well. Middle housing generally middle housing regulations should be no more prohibitive than detached single dwelling regulations if what you're trying to do is to create more middle housing. Oftentimes density allowances need to be substantially higher than single family housing. Even if that house scale remains the same, the densities need to change to be able to allow those units. Some of what we call dimensional standards, but things like lot coverages and setbacks can sometimes be too restrictive and need to be adjusted and modified to be able to support these housing types. Cities should also think about the relationship between state building codes and internal conversions. Again, this is, you might have a larger, older house that you want to convert into multiple units or create multi-generational housing out of. Sometimes local zoning regulations can enable that, but sometimes there's also state building code limitations. So also looking at the state building codes in relation to local regulations, impact fees, utility connections, and some of these other sort of cost associated things with development that sometimes we don't really think about really can impact the kinds of housing that you get. So think about impact fees and utility connections and how those are related to the desired housing types that you're looking to see in your community. On the home ownership side, developers and buyers both really prefer fee simple development. That means that a unit is on its own lot. You own the unit and the land instead of a condo approach. And so thinking about in local regulations, what land division standards look like, and to create more of that fee simple development to enable more of this housing to get built. Parking sometimes can be a challenge when you're trying to have create multiple units on a site that also require multiple off-street parking stalls just to physically fit. So just thinking generally about the relationship between the physical site of size of parcels, what you're trying to build, and the housing and the parking required. Usually we start at a place of trying to think about one parking stall, off-street parking, or sorry, one off-street parking space per unit for each unit in the middle housing, and then have some more sort of testing and thinking about the physical nature if you go up from there. Next slide, Jennifer. And I'm going to pass it over to Jennifer to talk about ADUs.
Thank you, Tyler. All very helpful information. We're going to talk about accessory dwelling units. This is another strategy to consider in your toolkit to help address the housing needs that are coming along and emerging over the next decade or so. Accessory dwelling units can be considered a form of middle housing. It just depends on how a local jurisdiction defines them. But they are definitely, you know, in between the single family detached and an apartment. The ADU popularity has been growing across the nation. There's definitely an increase in ADUs, especially along the West Coast, and this is becoming a more popular form of housing, particularly if you like to have a smaller housing space and you like more flexibility within your housing property. All right, so to get a definition of accessory dwelling units, they're generally defined as small, self-contained residential units with a kitchen and bathroom located on the same parcel as an existing primary single dwelling home. They can be known as secondary units, carriage homes, mother-in-law suites, granny flats. There's a lot of different terms that are used to refer to ADUs. Backyard homes is another term that people use. What's interesting about ADUs is they can take a broad range of configurations, as is shown on a graphic on the top left. This is from ARP's material, the ABCs of ADUs. They can be in a detached format. They can be attached to the main primary single family home. They can also be in an interior type configuration. They can be like in an attic or a basement. They can also be above a garage. I actually have an ADU that is above a garage, and it's very nice to have that. And they can also be a garage conversion. And I used to have one that was a converted garage. So there's a lot of different ways that ADUs can be added to a property. So they're a really nice strategy to consider because they can help blend in within existing neighborhoods and provide just, you know, a bit more housing unit options. Here's some examples of different types of ADUs. A lot of these are more detached examples. We wanted to show different sizes and configurations. Some are built 2 stories, which can be nice if you'd like a little bit more space. A lot of them can be can have accommodations added to help older adults be able to access the housing a bit better. They are often designed to blend into neighborhoods and to just kind of fit in with an existing single family detached home lot. So there's a lot of creativity that is emerging and on how to design these ADUs. There are various benefits of accessory dwelling units. They can provide an extra source of income, which can be really, really helpful if you are aging in place and you are not having, you're living off a fixed income and you have to still pay for property taxes and other expenses. So this can be a really great source of income to help promote stability. Another benefit is that it can allow for a reduced housing space when you want to downsize. Maybe you don't want to have a yard to take care of. So this can be particularly helpful for older adults. They can be designed to provide accommodations such as wider doorways, zero step entries, more fixtures to help with mobility. They can be used by family members or caregivers to help provide another form of multi-generational housing. ARP puts out a survey every year to ask about housing preferences, and it's one of the top types of housing that people are finding to be needed to help them stay in communities. And this chart on the right shows the growth in ADU listings, and it's related to real estate listings. So you can see that there's definitely a growth in more housing having ADUs as a part of their property. So there are a variety of different users of ADUs. I think the overall point of this is that they're very helpful because they can have flexible use. They can be used differently throughout their existence. They can be used by a family that maybe needs a nanny or somebody to help with their children, or an older parent. They can be used by that family when they are an empty nest and they don't have children at home, and if they'd like to have a smaller type of house. So there's a lot of flexibility in how they can be used. And I think that's something that a lot of people are attracted to with ADUs. So there are some main ways to finance the construction of an ADU. Most often, people use cash savings or family loans to help finance ADUs. This chart on the right kind of shows the main sources. And the next type of financing option is a home equity line of credit. The ADUs tend to be more less expensive if it is a conversion. There's less walls and materials that you need to build the ADU, and it can be converted from a basement or a garage. Cities can look at ways to help reduce the upfront costs to help keep down the construction costs. This can be done through permitting fees, having a reduction in those types of permitting fees that might be required. There can be a reduction in impact fees and some of those other upfront fees that can make it more challenging to construct an ADU. So a lot of the ADU best practices are at a local level, obviously, and it's similar to what Tyler had mentioned. A lot of these are similar to middle housing best practices. So there are some best practices that are emerging that are really helpful for communities to consider if they are wanting to encourage this type of housing. The big best practice is to adopt by right provisions in residential zones, and as much as possible, not have a conditional use permit. This really helps to make it more feasible to develop an ADU. Another best practice is to simplify the building permit process as much as possible, to streamline it, to reduce the waiting time for a permit to be approved. Parking is another area of best practices. Parking is very expensive. It takes up land, especially in urban areas. It can be very hard to provide a lot of parking. So as much as possible to reduce the amount of required parking spots. A lot of times we suggest no more than one parking spot per housing unit. And also to allow for shared parking arrangements. That can be a way to encourage more people to be able to feasibly develop ADUs. Another area is to adopt simple and flexible dimensional standards, and a lot of the recommendations are similar that were mentioned for middle housing. ADUs are more valuable if occupancy is not restricted. There are some jurisdictions that restrict ADUs to family members, and that can be pretty restrictive and it can cause a barrier with having more flexible use of your ADU. Another stretch kind of goal to consider is to allow 2 ADUs per lot. There are some jurisdictions that are allowing this. City of Seattle is one of the first jurisdictions that come to mind, where they allow every lot to have a detached ADU in a attached ADU. So we have a little chart here that kind of looks at some of the decision points that you might consider if you are a homeowner that is interested in ADUs. Some of the things that you might want to consider is whether you have space in your property that is underutilized, that would have enough room for an ADU, and that would have access to a driveway or a roadway. Do you have family or other people that you would like to have live on your property? Or would you like to rent it out and have another source of income? You might want to consider having an ADU later in life when you'd like to downsize and not have as much housing space to take care of, and you could rent out your main house. Do you have a need for any caregivers to live on site or family members? And would you like some more income, another source of passive income? So there's just some questions to ask yourself if you are considering building an ADU. There's a lot more information on AARP's website that can help walk you through what it might take to build an ADU that we'll share at the end of the presentation. So we'll give a quick summary of the strategies that we discussed, but overall, we just want to emphasize there's no silver bullet in terms of strategies for resolving the challenge of meeting the housing need in different communities. It usually takes many different strategies that are addressing different household income levels and household needs. So overall, it helps to have a balanced approach in communities to help address the housing needs. And the state can help in many ways by providing financial resources, and local governments can help with providing regulatory restrictions that are easier to overcome, and incentives. They can provide incentives, and nonprofits and developers obviously are very important to the strategies and to meeting the housing needs overall. But some of the strategies to consider are outlined here. Education is one of the fundamental types of strategies, and having education that really helps to outline what an accessory dwelling unit is, or whatever type of housing you are promoting, is really helpful. And to walk through, like, how would you build an ADU, or how would you permit an ADU? Checklists and information can be very like that can be very helpful. Webinars are very helpful. Conferences and panels with people describing their experience building different ADUs, or changing regulations, or supporting innovative housing projects can be very helpful. I think education also should be geared towards realtors and developers, so that there can be more comfort built with looking at different types of housing that they may not be used to building. So that's something to consider. AARP has a database of different case study experiences with ADUs, and that's been very helpful to look at. People talk about how they built their ADU, how they financed it, how they use it. They'll provide pictures to show what it looks like, and that's been very helpful for just understanding the range of uses and users. Also, another type of strategy that several jurisdictions have implemented are these pre-approved ADU plans. They are plans that have been built to code, and they are they're designed to be built to code, and they can be applied to different properties. Of course, there is a site design process that you have to look at whether your property has enough space. But it is a pre-approved plan. So if they're able to implement it on that property, they're having a much quicker permitting process, and it's much it can be from 6 to 8 months down to like 6 weeks. So that's been an area of development in several jurisdictions. Another consideration is demonstration projects or pilot projects to help share information on different types of housing and innovative strategies for building that type of housing. It's also important to measure performance and how well you're meeting your housing needs. The statewide housing needs assessment was a really great step to kind of look at the problem and how much housing is needed, but it's also important to look at how well the state is helping to meet that need. And dashboards and annual reports can help with that. It's also important to celebrate successes with housing developments and share examples, and not just talk about how you're not meeting your progress and your goals. At the state level, there are some opportunities to provide more grants or financing, possibly for middle housing. There's a consideration of possibly providing grants for needs assessment at the local level or regional level. We work on a lot of projects that involve housing needs assessments, and it's also very helpful after you have that needs assessment to develop action plans that are targeting the challenges and the most prevalent needs that are presented in different contexts and communities. There's some new federal funding emerging, so stay tuned on that one. We just have a little bit of information on that. We also are looking at what's emerging, but there's some possible housing support that will come through incentives for jurisdictions that are doing zoning reform, and possibly some new financing for housing. And it's also important to consider different ways to advance supportive policies. We mentioned that a lot of times middle housing and ADUs were illegal way back in the day, over 50 years ago. And it's important to look at ways to re-legalize middle housing and ADUs to make it more feasible to build. And at the state level, there should be some consideration whether there's some ways that the state can support meeting the housing needs through various provisions. So another area to consider is just supporting partnerships, especially with affordable housing. We find that a lot of affordable housing is built based off of really complex partnerships, so it's really difficult to build affordable housing. So it's important to nurture those partnerships, strengthen partnerships that are already in place, and to consider ways to do something more innovative, or show how the different communities could build something that others may not be familiar with. And it's helpful to have partnerships with nonprofits and developers and public agencies, because they all offer something different to the table. So nurturing those partnerships is really important. And on this slide, we have just a list of a bunch of different resources from ARP and other sources that may be of interest. There is a lot of education out there to be aware of. There's an ADU model state act that could be looked at that has a lot of great advice. There's an ADU video series that's available. There's even information on how to build an ADU to help build comfort and understanding how an ADU could be built. And there's similar information for middle housing, although middle housing covers a lot more different types of housing types. So there's quite a range of middle housing types, and more information probably needed. And as Tyler mentioned, there is a middle housing model ordinance that tentatively will probably be released in 2023. We're hoping there'll be some education to help spread that information. And provide more of a forum for conversation and to help share the different findings and insights. And then we have a list of North Dakota resources. On the top is the link to the North Dakota housing needs assessment. There's a lot of different documents associated with this housing needs assessment. There are housing profiles, there's detailed tables, and there's a combined report, and there's a condensed version of the report. It's like an executive summary that provides you the high level findings, so you don't have to read 200 pages. And then there's a presentation by Dr. Nancy Hodor that helps explain the findings, and all of this information is very helpful to check out. And there's some other information here on housing education, video series, and some housing development program information from the state. So that is our presentation in a nutshell. We did have some questions here. I would like to pass this off to Janelle or Dave to help facilitate whatever questions might need to be discussed. And I want to also note that there are some questions in the chat. So.
Yes, thank you very much, Jennifer and Tyler. We do have several questions in the chat, and I think we'll start with those before we move over to the questions that you have on the screen. But excellent presentation. I think you gave folks a really good understanding about, number one, what missing middle housing is and some potential strategies to address that based on North Dakota specific needs. I think that's always important that we find things that are based on what we're seeing and hearing in North Dakota and how to address that. So I think, Tyler, the first question comes to you. So it was a question from Natalie. We talk about smaller scale cost to construct things, but few developers want to try to build missing middle housing. And I think this is a common theme that I hear when I go out across the state, but very few developers want to look at missing middle housing. So if you want to read back slide 14, Jennifer, it said the cost per unit of missing middle housing is less. Can you talk about how it's less expensive or what factors have to be in place to make it less expensive, Tyler?
Yeah, thanks, Janelle and Natalie. Big question. I would start off and answer this question to say that developers are all very different, and they have very different perspectives about how and when and why they would think about different housing types as part of their business model. We tend to think about really three different kinds of developers within a middle housing space. We have what I will call like small local developers / entrepreneurs. Sometimes those folks are doing one project a year, one project every couple of years. Oftentimes they are real estate agents with architects that they'll hire, maybe have friends or family that are general contractors and sort of make a project work. We have regional builders, so folks that might work in North Dakota or other nearby states that do a few more projects a year, a little bit bigger scale. Sometimes those are sort of what we would call sort of short plat subdivisions, something that's 10 units on a relatively small site. And then we have sort of larger institutional developers. These are the larger home builders, folks like Lennar, D.R. Horton, KB Homes, those sort of folks. So we think about middle housing and how that relates to different developer types in different ways. We do a lot. I think one thing that is helpful is to have a sort of education campaign, capacity building campaign with the development community specifically around middle housing and what's helpful. So I spend a lot of time talking to a lot of those home builder organizations, whether through, breakfast meetings or lunch panels and that sorts of thing with a lot of those groups to just understand where their issues and challenges are and sort of help to highlight where there are either regulatory barriers or cost barriers or other things. Sometimes, well, most times, frankly, it's about 50-50 split of some developers that are interested in middle housing and some that aren't because they have a product that works. They've done it for a long time. And why would they do something different? So there's a wide range of developers that will either do this or not do this. In the larger scale, the sort of institutional, sort of larger subdivision developers, what we're seeing is that they're not switching all the way over to, or even substantially over to middle housing. What they're doing is integrating more middle housing types into their overall master plan or plan development. And that means that they'll have a higher share of townhomes or a higher share of plexes or a higher share of smaller apartment buildings, which sort of increases the density across the entire site marginally. So you might go from something like, say, 15 dwelling units per acre on average across the master plan development to 18 dwelling units per acre. In doing so, though, you might see a meaningful amount of new housing types being built as part of those master plan developments. The cost side and the reference to this slide 14 is really the cost for the buyer. And the difference, even on the buyer side, is there's two things. One is what we call the sort of nominal value of that housing unit, or the absolute purchase price, is usually lower because of the size of the unit and the efficiencies with the land. But the price per square foot, both for the construction costs and for the buyer, generally does tend to be a little bit higher. But it's the nominal price of that unit, because it's smaller, that is generally more expensive than a larger detached single family, even if that price per square foot is more expensive. From a development side of things, there are additional costs. Like I mentioned, there's shared walls, there's utilities, can be fire code, fire separation requirements, some of those things that add additional costs. but there are some savings both in the process on sometimes the permit review side, but usually in the cost of the land. But that only works when you've got developers that are interested in building that housing type and exploring it. And that's certainly not everybody. That was a long answer to a big question, so I apologize.
It was a big question, so I think it deserved a big answer. So that was excellent. Is there anything that you wanted to add, Jennifer or Dave, from your perspective to that question?
Well, I will. Tyler brought up that it might be somebody that does this might be like a real estate agent or a single, one person or two people doing development, and they've done that here in Bismarck. I know there's been some of that done in older neighborhoods. There's been an empty lot. They put a duplex on it. So obviously that was cheaper for them than trying to put a single family one in there, and it probably optimized their costs. Whether they're being rented or not, I don't know. And then I know downtown there's somebody that's building. They look like, I think they're 4 plexes, and it looks like 3 of them together, all on this lot that had old housing on it, and they tore it down and they're putting this up. So it does work out. And I don't know. It's right now, I think there's also the issue of the builders are busy enough with, or have been busy enough with building single family homes. They've only got so much labor to go around, and the material costs, that certainly is, drives it also for a lot of them. So
one of the things, and Dave, just to build on some of your points, one of the things that we're seeing with some of those larger developers, that sort of more subdivision type developers, those that are starting to build more middle housing types in the overall housing mix of their development project, we've asked them why, and there's 2 reasons that's really interesting. One is they see an unmet segment of demand for smaller units, that somebody just either from a price point or from a needs perspective doesn't need a large detached single family house, but wants to own something in a newer community and that with the amenities that are being built as part of that larger subdivision. So they see meeting a need that's currently not being met, and they're sort of trying to explore what that looks like. The other thing that's kind of interesting is they see a diversity of housing within a larger development as a way to hedge against risk on absorption of having all of the same kinds of units. And so they're starting to sort of dabble a little bit more with different housing types, knowing that it creates more flexibility around absorption time and sales essentially of those units, and them not all being the same. So we're hearing positive things from some of those larger developers and how they're thinking about the sort of flexibility of middle housing. But there's also some headwinds, as Dave mentioned earlier, some sort of national global economic headwinds around inflation and interest rates and cost of capital, and a lot of things that are real for developers and real for home buyers, but are cyclical. And so it's important for us to think about housing policy more broadly over the long term, to be able to set the market up for when things do get a little more stabilized or certain within the context of housing finance and the housing market.
Thanks, Dave and Tyler. That was really good. Do based on your work across the country, and this is for either you or Jennifer, just kind of building on that, are there things that incentivize developers to look at missing middle housing? I mean, if you see someone in their niche, this is what they do. In your work across the country, are there things that motivate people to move in that direction if they're not there yet, but could they be there in the future?
Yeah, that's a really good question. We have found, because we do a lot of work helping cities develop these regulations and zoning codes and incentive structures, it's a little bit of a balance between setting in your base regulations, your sort of by right allowances to do the thing that you want to do. And when you do that, you remove some of the ability to have some incentives, whether that's a regulatory incentive or financial incentive. But what we've found is really helpful is to allow these housing types, get this development standards and the zoning in a place where you can physically build it, communicate with your development stakeholders that it's feasible and likely to move the needle in the direction that you want it to go. And then on the incentive side, what we're seeing being really helpful is either process or fee incentives. And so having a streamlined or a priority permit review process for the housing types that you want is helpful. And then also thinking about the structure of any impact fees or utility hookups or that sort of thing. One of the best practices that we've been working with is around having a scaled impact fee structure, for example, where you're having impact fees that are related to the size and the type of the unit. So if you're charging the same impact fee, for example, to a large 3,000 square foot detached single family as you are to a 1,200 square foot unit in a townhome, there's a disproportionate incentive to go to the single family because you're already charging the same amount in impact fees. So what we're starting to see is more communities think about impact fees scaled to either the size of the unit or the types of the housing that they want to get built. And that, that's also has to be sort of calibrated to the need to provide infrastructure and fund the infrastructure for housing to be built. But that sort of impact fee waiver along with the process improvement seems to be being helpful for a lot of communities.
I'll chime in and just say that having less discretionary review, like design review, and some of those types of processes can be really difficult and hard to navigate, and time is money, and so that can be one of the ways to reduce that upfront cost. And one of the other strategies that some communities are doing is delaying when the fees or permitting fees are due till way after the construction, maybe after the place has been constructed and at the occupancy point. So different strategies like that can be helpful.
Excellent. We do have another question that came from Ben. So he was also looking for examples of communities that might have best practice policies in place from zoning or building code perspective to encourage missing middle housing and ADUs. So again, kind of building on incentives, but he's looking for specific examples or policies of best practices. Any insight there, either of you?
Yeah, I saw that question and I was starting to write down some of it's going to be more West Coast examples that I'll provide, but Portland, Oregon, that's that graphic on the bottom right is from Portland, Oregon. They have done a lot for middle housing and ADUs. Eugene, Oregon is a smaller city that has recently had some changes to their middle housing regulations, in the state of Oregon. As a whole has had some changes. And Seattle, Washington has some great ADU policies that are helpful to look at. They've seen an increase in ADU development. California, many places in California have a statewide ADU policy that has been helpful, and also with middle housing. And another place to think about is like Vermont, Burlington, Vermont. We were just working with them on an engagement, and they've been making some good progress on both middle housing and ADUs. And I'll hand it off to Tyler.
Yeah, Jennifer just mentioned a lot of West Coast places, and part of the reason is because of state legislation in some of the West Coast cities or West Coast states. Oregon in 2019, the state passed legislation that requires all jurisdictions, 10,000 people to 20,000 people, to allow duplexes on all single family lots, and any jurisdictions with 20,000 or more people to allow the whole range of middle housing types on all single dwelling lots throughout the community. So a lot of the best practices are around local implementation of those state requirements at this point. And that was a caveat before I mentioned also Eugene. Oregon's done a good job. They have very different, they've got a sort of traditional historic downtown. They've got some sort of more compact historic neighborhoods, but they've also got a lot of suburban areas, a lot of rural edge areas, where they've thought a lot about some of these issues and thinking about middle housing in those rural and suburban contexts that I think is really interesting. They also had a zoning code structure that was created to incent less expensive housing too. So they did a good job in sort of building to how to create more or less expensive housing through their zoning code. Washington County is a county jurisdiction, not a city in Oregon, that is suburban and rural, that did a really good job in thinking more about sort of the dynamics around infrastructure service and utilities and right-of-way improvements and how that relates to their middle housing. And especially given the kind of development in the sort of rural suburban context, exurban context that they see. So those are two good examples that I think, folks in North Dakota could look to get a little bit broader, sort of suburban rural approaches there.
And I would just say that middle housing and ADUs are in a lot of older cities.
Yeah.
I lived in a city in Gainesville, Florida. They were all over in the older neighborhoods. So there's probably some more examples where there is that historical architecture.
No, I think both of your examples were really well done. And yeah, I'd like to mention too that, you know, we had another project that we worked with the City of Milner and the Department of Commerce recently. And so I know they presented with Carol from the City of Milner and Josh Asvig, our state director, presented at the Main Street Initiative specifically on a missing middle housing project in Milner, North Dakota. So it is possible. I know I tease Jennifer all the time about, you know, how can we find examples that really fit the, where we're from and what it looks like here. And it really was an example. We worked with another TA provider, but it was an example of these projects are possible anywhere. So I think it's another thing. And the screen that you have in front of you, you know, we do have copies of the missing middle housing booklet in our office. I did put that in the chat. If you ever want a copy, you're welcome to reach out to me and I can get you a copy of that. The other link on the bottom is a webinar. We did a 4-part webinar series that was really kind of incrementally inching people to think about different ways to meet housing needs in their community. So there is a piece on making home modifications. There is a piece on ADUs. So the link on these slides really give you access to other resources depending on where your community is at. And we know everybody's at a different place, but there are examples and we'd be happy to share some of the information from the City of Milner. And I'm sure Carol would be happy to chime in about what that process looked like for her. I think we have one more question in here. So pre-made ADUs, this would be a Jennifer question, I suspect. She has an acre of property and would like to rent it out because there's such a housing shortage for rentals. So can you do a pre-made ADU?
That's a really, really good question. I haven't heard of a whole lot of examples other than these, these pre-designed plans. I put this slide in thinking people might want a little bit more information. I have seen it with tiny homes, though. That is something we have a lot of. There's a nonprofit called Lehigh that will make tiny homes inside of a warehouse and bring them to different, more as a development for houseless and other types of transitional emergency kind of shelter housing. But I have heard that it's just way more cheaper and easier to do it when you are building it in a warehouse and then you do deliver it. So I don't know about the commercial availability, but that's a really great idea. I've heard about some developers considering that because it is more efficient to have everything indoors and whatnot. But I'll pass it off to Tyler, see if he has any ideas either. But that's I know.
There are a number of companies that do prefab sort of ADUs. That there's two challenges. One is oftentimes it's really hard to get those pre-built prefab ADUs to work within local zoning regulations. And so you don't have that sort of flexibility to respond to your local regulations. If local regulations aren't a big issue where you are, then there's lots of options that are available. Utility service is something that still needs to have some sort of on-site component, right? So you have to get your water, wastewater, stormwater, electrical, all of your utilities still need to be sort of connected to the grid. And then we have heard some challenges recently about having local expertise to be able to assemble and even, put on pre-built ADUs onto a site, because you still need to be able to put it onto a slab foundation, for example. And it's a kind of a specialized skill set, but if you have a general contractor in your community, it's a good idea to talk to them and get their familiarity or comfort level and start to explore some options. Lenders typically are more averse to pre-built ADUs than traditional stick-built construction. But those challenges are starting to be overcome, especially in more rural communities when there's challenges with labor and workforce around construction and having the right amount of contractors to be able to do that. But there's options out there. There's some unique challenges to that, but there are options out there for pre-built prefab ADUs. There's a whole range of like having a whole house that's actually delivered on a truck bed, or putting them together and built on site, to panelized construction where you could have prefab panels that are sort of placed and connected in site. So there's a whole range of options that are available, and there's more companies these days doing that than there has been in the past too.
Janelle, just
Please go ahead, Dave. Yes. Mhm.
Kind of going to what Tyler said. There is, I just saw this Monday, I think I was looking, and I came across this Lichty homes here that are based in North Dakota. They're primarily a manufactured house dealer. They are selling they're calling it a cabin, but it looks like a tiny home. I would guess it's about 500 square feet, main floor living, and then you've got upper that's got like a loft in it. I don't know what the price is, but they've got the crews to go out and put it on. But it comes down to zoning and that and whatnot. That would be the question for a community, if they would allow that manufactured home to be put on the lot. But it's available. Something like that's available.
Well, that's positive news. We're about 20 minutes left, and folks, if you have other questions, you're free to put them in the Q&A feature. Jennifer, I know you had some. Oh, you do have them in front of us. Oh, we do have one more. Natalie has another question for us. So, any advice about success stories when looking at land trusts or unit types, entry-level bungalow courts, when a buyer doesn't own the land but they own the housing units? And then there's one for Dave in particular. So we'll do the first one first. Either Tyler or Jennifer, if you want to answer Natalie's question, and then we'll do the next one for Dave.
Yeah, I can start, and then I'll let Dave talk about the challenges with local financing of land trusts. We are doing a lot more of this now, and I think there's a couple things that I would say related to community land trusts is that it's a good model. There isn't local level capacity in all places that we've had these conversations to be able to support stability of land trusts over time. It's a sort of specialized thing, but it is a good model. There's a number of, as you mentioned, I think bungalow courts or cottage clusters. I live in Portland, that have been built, or older buildings that have been acquired and then had units added to them in a sort of bungalow configuration that are in a land trust. There's a number of them. It's been a successful model. That land trust has been around for about 30 years, and they do a really good job and have a system in place to be able to do that. We've also been starting to look more into shared equity models of community land trusts. Outside of Eugene, Oregon, there's a community called Springfield, where there's a really good example. It's called D Street Village, is a shared equity land trust model that there's, I think, 6 units that are built at 60% AMI and below. That's a shared equity ownership. It's less of a sort of traditional sort of bungalow court. It's got one main house that was split up into multiple units, and then a couple smaller detached units that were built adjacent to it, but do have a common area that's shared. That's a pretty interesting model. It's really hard for lenders, unless you have local community banks or credit unions that have flexible lending products, to be able to work with a developer to do that. The example in Springfield that I gave really had a interesting and unique sort of capital stack to be able to get that to work. They had local equity partners. They had a local credit union that helped support the long-term construction loan and long-term financing. But then they also brought in some state financing and local financing to be able to cover the feasibility gap because of the risk associated with the long-term debt obligations with the lenders. So we're increasingly trying to figure this out more, but it really does in our experience, comes down to a local sort of lending capacity and what your local lenders are comfortable doing, and sort of working with your local lenders to figure that out.
Okay, I've got the second part of the question.
You do.
For Natalie asking us, are there major legal or financing hangups we see to making community land trust loans? We have worked with the Grand Forks Community Land Trust since it started over a decade ago. We helped them get their policies put in place, and the financing hangups have been taken care of with that. We've been buying the loans that the private lenders have originated on those land trust properties. We've been buying those loans for the last decade in Grand Forks. We've also done Minot's Land Trust. We've helped out with that and are buying the mortgages there. Grand Forks had a lot of empty lots from the flood in '97 that they owned. So the city turned those over to the land trust, and the land trust put up smaller homes on those small lots. worked out great. Their focus was on, you know, low to moderate income households, primarily, that they were targeting to purchase those homes. And then since 2017, 2019, maybe, we provide a community land trust line of credit to Bismarck, or to Grand Forks, where they're using that to purchase and rehab existing homes. And then once they sell the place, they pay us back that line of credit that they've drawn on to do that. We've been able to do it successfully. The local banks have worked out any hangups they have. You've got appraisers in that area that know how to appraise the properties. There is, you know, the larger secondary market of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac do have underwriting criteria for community land trust loans. So the process is out there. The Cass Clay Community Land Trust is also started up. We're not buying loans through them yet, or well, we are buying the mortgages, but we're not providing any additional subsidies for them, or the line of credit for them. The benefits that they've had, Grand Forks, the city turned over a lot of their home dollars to get that land trust started. So they've had, and then the Grand Forks Housing Authority provided a lot of the admin support. And then they actually went out and helped the Minot Land Trust get started and continue to provide admin support there. So right now, you've either got to be really great at fundraising, or have that, you know, community dollars that are available through the city or the state that could provide for that admin cost of setting something up. But it's certainly doable, and it's been proven here in North Dakota that it works.
Well, thank you both for that. Again, we have just a few minutes left, so if you have any other questions, you can go ahead and type that into the Q&A feature. But Dave, I guess, you know, kind of moving towards, you know, next steps. I know we're gearing up for a legislative session, which starts in January. I know we've been going across the state, really having conversations with our members and legislators about priorities. And I know you're having discussions too. And I know folks, you can see the questions on the screen. These are questions that you can have internally. You can have them with community partners. I think these are great discussion points to think about where you're at as a community, and how you can start to look at and address the needs. If you do need light nighttime reading, that is the full needs assessment, right, Dave? If you do. Okay, but if you're looking for the Cliff Notes version, he did provide the you know, executive summary, which is part of these slides, and we'll make them available to you so you can go and look and see if you can dig into more about what's in your community. But the discussion questions are really something you can use to start the dialogue, to dig a little deeper. This is just really scraping the surface about what's going on in the state, and how can we start to address that. But I'll let you do some closing statements, you know, or comments, Dave, about, you know, kind of what you see going into the legislative session, and how the needs assessment will kind of frame, you know, some of the work that we plan to do in the next year, not just legislatively, but just in general. So,
well, you know, our purpose internally for the housing needs assessment is where do we have to focus our programs at? You know, we have the federal housing programs that we administer on behalf of the state, and you know, we set a allocation plan for those programs every year. This helps us put that together on where do we have to focus. You know, housing for 65 and plus is certainly going to be important, just by looking at the population trend there. You know, we're also, you know, internally, we're trying to get the legislators to allow us to use our assets better than they've allowed us to in the past, so we can generate some more revenue that we could then use in our current programs for housing rehab and housing accessibility that could be utilized better than they have been. So that's, you know, we want to be able to show what are the needs going to be going forward. So that was our purpose internally. But I also think, you know, as communities, you can use this, and, you know, housing service providers, you can use this report, you know, for homeless individuals, you know, people experiencing homelessness, that senior population that you may be, you know, helping assist. What do they need? You know, it goes into, health and human services, et cetera. And, so go out there and look at it and, take a stab at the condensed version. That's 30 pages, and then see what might interest you. And then you can look into the profiles deeper, and the tables. But educate your legislators on the need for housing in your community. That's the biggest thing, and that's what this needs assessment will hopefully help you to be able to do that.
That's an excellent point. Education goes a long way. So good. Jennifer, Tyler, do you have anything to add, or any closing thoughts? Again, thank you so much for being on this webinar with us today. It was super helpful.
Yeah, we really enjoyed helping out your communities on these housing topics. I want to put a plug in for AARP Livable Community Technical Assistance Grants. They release them, I think, pretty much every year. So if there's a community that would like a little bit more technical assistance, consider applying for one of those. And Janelle can tell you about them. And they might have changes from year to year, but overall they want to provide support to different communities. So that might be something to consider also.
Yeah, and I see Tyler did put in the comment section. Yeah, we'll have access to those technical assistance grants, and you work in partnership with us at the state office. So if you have interest in things that we've talked about today, either missing middle housing, or we have helped communities with code audits and zone reviews as well, through our technical assistance partners, the possibilities really are open. They tend to have buckets of technical assistance, different themes, different ideas that they're seeing across the country, that they really want to pool resources to make sure that we have the best TA providers like Echo Northwest, like Opticos. They really have the best experts here at our fingertips. So again, don't hesitate to reach out to me at AARP, or Josh Aspig, our state director. We'd be happy to talk this through a little bit more. But it's been a pleasure working with Dave and Housing Finance. This truly is about partnerships. Jennifer and Tyler talked about that. Getting this work done in a small state like ours really depend on partnerships, not just at the state level, but also at the local level. So we really encourage you to reach out to us or Housing Finance and have these discussions. We know that this is just the beginning, and we hope to continue this dialogue. So again, thank you, Jennifer, and everybody for joining us today. And the slides will be made available, and we did record this, so we'll make sure that if you would like to have a copy of this or share it with others, or to watch it later, you'll have that available again to you. And other events that you can check out for AARP that are coming up, go to aarp.org/ND events. Again, thank you for joining us, and have a great day.